Hello and welcome to this lesson. In this lesson, I'm going to introduce you to the Amazon Virtual Private Cloud, or VPC. VPC is a logically isolated portion of the AWS cloud into which we can deploy our AWS resources. Now we have lots of control within the VPC. We can define our own IPv4 and v6 address ranges, create our own subnets, configure route tables and gateways and so on. So we get lots of control, and as I mentioned before, it's logically isolated. So it gives you that level of protection from other people's resources on AWS. So let's have a look at the structure of a VPC. Now, the first thing to understand is it's a logically isolated portion of the AWS cloud within a region. So regions mean that you're deploying your resources within a VPC in a geographical area around the world. There's quite a lot of AWS regions, and we have to choose the region where we want to deploy our resources, and then we can create our VPCs within that region. Within regions, there's a concept of an availability zone. An availability zone is essentially a data center. It can actually be composed of one or more data centers, but think about an AZ as being a separate data center, which means if you deploy your resources across different availability zones, then there's a level of redundancy there in that there's no single points of failure. These are separate physical facilities in which your application is running. Now, what we do in our VPC is we create subnets and we attach those subnets to the availability zones. Those subnets can be private subnets or public subnets, which we'll talk about a bit more soon. And then we can deploy our resources such as Amazon EC2 instances into our subnets. Within a VPC, there's something called the implicit router. So you don't actually see this router, you don't actually get to interact with it except by configuring the route table. But every time you send data from resources in one subnet to resources in another subnet, it will be going via the implicit router. So we can control how traffic gets routed by using the route table. So the route table is associated with the implicit router, and we can define how we send data. Now, by default, there'll be a local target for the IP address range of the VPC. And that just means that traffic will be routed between all subnets within the VPC without any further configuration. Now, what if we then want to send data out to the internet? Well, then we need to attach something called an internet gateway to the VPC. The internet gateway is used to connect to the internet, and we have an entry in our route table here. And this IP address is a special IP address that basically means any IP. Now, route tables use the most specific match. So in this case, if data is being sent to this particular IP range with a /16 subnet mask, that's more specific than this any IP address here with a 0 subnet mask. So what that means is the data will get routed locally. But for everything else, everything that doesn't match a previous rule in the routing table, it's going to send it to the internet gateway. So that means all internet traffic is going to go out to the internet gateway. Another concept to understand is the difference between private services and public services. So we've got EC2 instances in our VPC. We might have Amazon RDS databases or EFS file systems. But these all have endpoints that are within our VPC. That means the addresses used to connect to them are addresses within the private IP address ranges of our VPC. Now, we can have public addresses, but as you'll see a bit later on in the course, those actually are translated by the internet gateway to the private IP address of the resource within the VPC. So these are private services that exist within the VPC, and they can also have public addresses, and we'll explore that a bit more later on in the section. Now, there's also public services. What this means is that these services have public endpoints. So the DNS addresses and the IP addresses of these particular services are on the internet. Now, there's more than we're showing here. I just wanted to show you a snapshot. So the key is that these have public endpoints rather than private endpoints. We can have multiple VPCs within each region, and each VPC has a separate block of IP addresses known as a CIDR block. That stands for classless inter-domain routing. And then each subnet within the VPC will actually have an IP address range from within that CIDR block. So this is why we need to define our CIDR blocks and our subnets correctly when we create our VPC, so that we make sure that we have enough subnets and enough hosts per subnet. And we'll look at how to do that a bit later on. I have a lesson where we're going to go through that and create our own ranges and then create our own custom VPCs. So that's it for this lesson. In the next lesson, we're going to do a walkthrough of the VPC console and have a look at what's set up when we first log into our account.